Good morning, everyone, and welcome to session 2 of the 2022 Envision Access Conference. The title of our presentation today is Perspectives of College Freshman Students with Disabilities, What Makes Them High Risk for Early Departure. My name is Tim Mollett. I'm Professor of Instruction of Spanish at Ohio University, and I'll be your moderator for this session. Your presenter this morning is Dr. Rosa Oroyan Kisling. Dr. Kisling is a public servant working for Homeland Security Investigations. Her current role is as an analyst working side by side with agents ensuring counter-proliferation of national defense armaments. She has also worked as computer forensics with agents working diligently in child exploitation cases. Prior to that, she retired after 21 years in the United States Air Force in the intelligence and communications arena. As a disabled veteran, Dr. Kisling has a passion for serving others, especially those who strive to better themselves despite their disabilities. Dr. Kisling's degree is conferred by North Central University. The chat window is open for the session. If you have any questions, just feel free to type them in the chat window. If we need to pause to address questions during the presentation, we will do so. And I will also add a link to a survey toward the end of this session, and we would really appreciate it if you could fill that out for us. It'll just take a few minutes. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Dr. Kisling. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate that. I am going to share my screen so you all can see my presentation. All right, can everybody see that? Okay,
yes.
So thank you. As Tim mentioned, that my presentation today is about perspectives of college freshman students with disabilities or SWDs. So if you hear me mention SWDs, that's really what I'm referring to in this context. It will be college freshman students with disabilities. What makes them high risk for early departure? And when we say early departure, it also means dropping out of college, basically departing from their degree program before they complete it. Hopefully at the end of this presentation, you guys will gain some insight into the thoughts of college freshmen SWDs as to what they think, what their perspectives are of the factors that will make them drop out of college. And at the same time, part of the study was asking them, okay, what can the institution do to keep you in college? So that's the second part, providing information that's important to help college administrators establish practices that promote learning and retention for SWDs. So story time, it's a little early, but I'm taking this as an opportunity to give you my personal narrative that led me to the problem statement of this study. See, back in 1991, I joined the United States Air Force military after I graduated from my bachelor's degree, and that was actually in the Philippines. While I was in the military, I served for about 21 years. I used the Air Force Tuition Assistance Program to pay for my master's degree. And after 21 years of serving, I did retire. And when I retired with multiple disabilities. Some of them were mobility, and most of them were unseen or invisible disabilities. But disabilities notwithstanding, I did go back to school. I used my GI Bill to pay for my doctorate degree. It was while I was doing my first few years as a doctoral degree that I was experiencing some challenges. And I also had commitments and obligations being a non-traditional student. I'm older, so it usually comes with like full-time employment. I was struggling with some of my classes, and I was thinking, how hard would it be for a college freshman with disabilities also? And that's really where my interest peaked. So I started doing initial research into the stories of college students with disabilities and found out that while their numbers do go up in matriculation, the completion rate or the graduation rate lags behind their non-disabled counterparts. And that brings us to the statement of the problem of the study that I did, which is SWDs are at a higher risk for early departure than non-disabled students. This is problematic for the student, the SWD, for the institution, and for society as a whole, because for the SWD, when you drop out, you are forfeiting the opportunity to earn higher income. And for the institution, that completion number or lack of the completion number, that impacts their funding in the future and also their rating. And then for society, they miss out on a potential talent in the workforce. So all around, this is problematic. But in order to delve into the study, you need to know what's out there. So what do we know about students with disabilities in higher education, in college? So student retention is a highly researched topic. And while I was sifting through hundreds of literature, I came across 4 themes that kept cropping up. So this is student retention, barriers to SWDs, institutional challenges, and support for students with disabilities. So let's delve into each one. First, let's look at student retention. What do we know about student retention? So in student retention,
Dr. Kisling,
yes.
your slides aren't advancing.
Oh, they are not advancing.
At
Okay,
least
let
I
me
don't see them advancing.
I am in the slide that says student retention. Do you see that? No.
No, I don't see that.
Do you see the themes?
No, I just see your first slide and I don't see it in slideshow mode.
Okay, let me stop sharing. Okay. Let me get out of that. Do you see my slides right now?
No, not yet. Okay.
Do you see that one? Statement of the problem?
But are you in slideshow mode or are you just going through each slide?
I'm in presentation mode.
Okay, I don't see it in presentation mode.
Okay, let me stop sharing. We do have wonderful technology that we have to work with sometimes. And I promised this worked while we were going through this 4 days ago.
It did when we practiced.
Okay, I'm going to do share screen.
Put
I'm
it in
in
presentation.
Windows.
Put it in presentation mode first, and then share your screen.
Okay, let's see, presentation mode. Do you see it? No.
Just can you just advance down each one because it's not doing presentation mode. But this is okay because we can now see your themes.
Okay, oh, you guys can see the themes?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm moving forward to student retention. And it's just a white screen that says student retention. I think maybe if I email this to you.
Yes, email it to me.
Okay, so.
Tim, do you see it in presentation mode?
No, actually, I was going to mention that too. I don't see it in presentation mode. But yesterday, just as an aside, yesterday I did have some issues with Zoom as well. And it was, I think that this is a Zoom issue. Teresa, you might be able to override that. I don't know if how that might work, but I had to, yesterday when I was teaching, I had to constantly unshare and reshare. And it was, I really think it was Zoom. So
I'm actually going to send this to Dr. Mackenzie, and maybe you can open it from your side.
Yes.
And worst case scenario, I can talk through it.
Okay.
So everybody just hang in there with us. You know, unfortunately, it looks like I'm having email issues because it's that kind of a day, but it's a wonderful day still.
It is.
There. So Dr. Mackenzie. There, I just sent it to you.
Okay.
And if it's okay with you, Teresa, I can still keep talking
Yes. Mm-hmm.
while we wait for your magic.
Okay. It has, I just received it. I'm going to open it. Okay, so you were at student retention.
Right.
So I'm going to go from current slide. And I'm going to share screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, we're good.
Awesome. Great. So I was talking about student retention and finding out what we know about it, what's out there literature wise. So as I was sifting through that, as I mentioned, this is one of the 4 themes that kept coming up. But student retention is a highly researched topic since 1960s because it's actually a prime indicator of a university's quality assurance. So there's high interest in the topic. And in fact, there's a few models on student retention, and I'll talk about Tinto's 1975 student retention model because Tinto is considered as the father of student retention topic. And what we do know is that throughout the years, all the way to 2010, numbers of enrollment matriculation has been climbing up. It peaked a little bit in 2010, and I do have a slide that shows that. And then it dips down a little bit. But for the most part, it had increased throughout the decades. So there's a lot of interest in this. But as I've mentioned earlier, the problem is that students with disabilities, while their matriculation has also increased, their graduation still lags behind. And this is the statistics that I have found. And I do apologize if this is too small for some. Just a quick side note, you notice that my slides are white background with black font. I was talking to a friend of mine, we'll call her Ali. She also has a disability. She suffers from migraine and she's also got other unseen disabilities. And I actually asked her opinion about slides because she told me that she was attending a Zoom presentation, very much like what we have right now. And the presenter presented his slides with a red background and black fonts. And that actually triggered her migraine. So 5 slides into the presentation, she had to walk out and just try to get herself composed before it got any worse. So I did consider that. So here's your white background and black fonts. Unfortunately for this, we do have this slide. I had to show it for the statistics to show on the left-hand side, you have the years showing 1991 all the way to 2019. And on the bottom will be the number of students enrolled in millions. You can see it peaked about 2010. The blue part is the number of students enrolled in a public four-year institution. And then the black part is the number of students enrolled in four-year private institutions. So 2010, we had about 15.14 million students enrolled, and 5.88 enrolled in private institutions. So these are able-bodied and also students with disabilities. Next slide, please. But what about the graduation rate? Here, it shows that it's about 48 to 50%, so about half graduate. And this is considering that they've been in school for 6 years, so they graduated within those 6 years. So there's 50%, but what about students with disabilities? What about their numbers? Next slide, please. So for students with disabilities, before 2015, it was about 10 to 11% of the population that has disabilities. So let's say in 2010, we have 15.14 plus the 5.88 in private institution. That totals about 21.02 million. Of those with disabilities is about 2.1 million. And out of those 2.1 million enrolled SWDs, only a third of students with disabilities who enroll actually graduate within 8 years. So for students with disabilities, usually they take longer. So if they enroll in a four-year college, they end up doubling that time. So about 8 years. So we'll give them about 8 years. So a third of the 2.1 million who enrolled in 2010, only about 63,000 of them will graduate within the next 8 years. Now, I also wanted to point that when 2010 peaked, from there up to 2019, the numbers decreased by about 1% each year. And the reason for that is we had a recession that happened about 2007 to 2009. So that affected the finances and that affected the matriculation. A lot of the students at this point were either going straight into workforce or they delayed their education. Then from 2019, we had COVID. So from 2020, there was actually a 3% decrease in matriculation. And then in 2021, there was another 3% decrease. I don't show it here, but those are the numbers. And next slide, please. So from 2015, 2016, there was another study and showed the statistics as students with disabilities increasing their numbers from the 10 to 11% prior to 2015 to 19.4% of the population of students enrolled. So from 2015 upwards, let's say the number there is 14.57 enrollees in public four-year institutions plus 5.42 enrollees in private four-year institutions, totaling about 20 million and a little change. Of those, about 3.9 million have disabilities. And out of that 3.9 million disabilities, we can expect about 1.3 million to graduate within their 8 years. So as I said, they lag behind quite considerably. Next slide, please. And students with disabilities, we want them to succeed. You know, I mentioned that there was a lot of literature since the 60s, and a lot of those literature studied traditional students. So 18 to 22 years old, straight out of high school, you graduate high school and then you enroll immediately into higher education. So those are your traditional students. But later on, later studies, they started delving into diverse groups, subgroups, like different socioeconomic and status, and those who enroll in 2-year institutions rather than 4-year institutions, those who work while they're going to school. So different demographics or subcultures of or subpopulations within higher education population. And students with disabilities are one of them. So there's been a lot of focus on students with disabilities because we want them to succeed. It's been known that bachelor's degree holders are 24% more likely to be employed than just having a high school graduation. It's not, a college diploma is not always a guaranteed success, but it does increase your chance. And if you are a student with disability, we want you to succeed. We want you to increase your chances of earning good income so that you can become independent, you will have more autonomy, and you will also be contributing to society. So compared to high school grads, bachelor's degree holders receive $82,000 less in government spending. So that's savings for the government. So that's about 82,000. And then because they tend to have better employment that pays better, they also tend to pay more in taxes. So they tend to pay about 273,000 more in taxes. So to the government, this translates to success for them because this is about 355,000 net benefit to the government, which in turn comes back to us. And also, bachelor degree holders are more civically engaged than their high school educated peers. They vote more, about 52%, or rather 75%. And then they're also twice more likely to volunteer. They're 3.5 times more likely to contribute to charity. So it's a win-win for everybody. It's a win for the student with disability. It's a win for the institution. It's a win for the society. Next slide, please. But there are also barriers for the students with disabilities. So let's say we do get them into higher education. There are still barriers for them. So some of those barriers, as I sifted through literature, the themes for those barriers are physical accessibility, stress and adjustments during transition, expectations versus reality, amount of transition preparedness, and then there's stigma. So let's take a look at physical accessibility. Next slide, please. This is actually the easiest one to address. It's very obvious, you see it. You see students with disabilities that are obvious, are seen, are visible. You see it, you see they have mobility or limb issues. They're probably in wheelchairs, they might be in a cane. So it's easy to accommodate for them. Not always the cheapest, because you will have to spend money on those physical accommodations, but you can address them. So things like parking spaces, close to building lecture halls, close to student services buildings, close to dormitories, and then wherever else they might have events. So parking spaces, and then ramps, elevators for wheelchairs. I do have a couple of stories for this. I was reading about a girl, a student with disability, and she's wheelchair bound. And in her university, they do have these things. They have ramps, but the ramps are dilapidated. And it actually takes her to hallways in back alleys. So it takes her longer to get to her classroom because she has to take this route all by herself. That adds time to her commute to work, to class. And then elevators. There was another story I read about a 24-year-old student, and it was a very cold day. It was sleeting. It was just really cold and nasty weather. So he was trying to make it to his class, and his building has an outside elevator wheelchair lift. So it's one of those where it's built into the side of a building, and then you wheel yourself in. The rest of the lift is open. So it's just the side, only halfway. Then you close the door, and then you push the button, and it lifts you up to your floor, and then you wheel yourself out. Then now you're inside the building. Well, on this very cold day, he wheeled himself in, and there was a malfunction of the lift. So he was stuck there in the elements and no help around. About 30 minutes later, building staff found him. So they were trying to work on that lift. In the meantime, he's getting pelted and they're putting jackets and blankets on him. By the time they had it going and he had warmed up, dried off, composed himself, and made his way to classroom, class was already over. So that affected his academic performance because you end up missing classes. And yes, while a lot of institutions do have this accessibilities, by checklist, they are compliant, but there's a need to go beyond that, to follow the spirit of the law and make sure that these accessibilities or accommodations are working, that they are well maintained, and perhaps reevaluated every couple years. Let's say you add another building to the campus. Do you have this necessary accommodations for that new part of the building? Or you start holding an event in another part of the campus. Well, will these students with disabilities be able to get there physically? But it's not just wheelchair bound that we have to think about. There's a lot of students that have vision problems, and it's an unseen disability. You can't see, they're wearing contacts or whatever. So we have to make sure that the hallways are well lit and that the signs are big enough. There's also another story for this. Another student, a female student, it ended up in a lot of embarrassing situations for her because of this problem, the vision problems and signs not being big enough. She'd end up in wrong dormitory rooms. She'd end up in the wrong classrooms. And one time she found herself in the university president's office while she was looking for the guidance counselor's office. So there are those considerations to have. And now, since we had a lot of veterans start using their GI Bill and going to higher education, a lot of them have PTSD or TBI or emotional problems. They have service pets, and we need to accommodate for service pets as well. So make sure that there is grass available for those pets to use bathrooms, and that those accessible grass is close enough to where they are, to the classroom. So if they do have to go, it doesn't take them a long time to go back to class. Having roomy toilet facilities. If you're in a wheelchair, do you have that accommodation for those students? And then there's also other areas in the campus, student services, like library, or even the canteen, or the guidance counselor, or clubs. So think about your members that have disabilities. Are there adjustable countertops or wheelchair spaces for them? And then, of course, dormitories. If you're putting them in a room, make sure that it can accommodate their wheelchair or whatever equipment they have. Do they have the bathroom for that? And another thing I'd like to bring up is those events. Let's say they get into the drama club or the Greek clubs, Greek societies. If they hold events, think about how your students can get there. And it's not also that, it's also the anxiety. Sometimes the students, even if they can get there physically, they worry about crowds, especially if they have anxiety in crowded settings. But that's really beyond the physical accessibility. So those are the things that you just have to think about to accommodate them. Okay, next slide, please. Stress and adjustments during transition. You know, college by itself is already stressful. It's a different environment altogether. So that initial entry into the college classroom, it induces anxiety in a lot of students. And that's true whether you're able-bodied or you have disabilities. Usually, this is the first time that they are away from everything that they're familiar with. They're away from family, from support, from friends who can say, yes, you can do this. It's over here, it's over there, to help them navigate. When they step into that college campus of their choice, a lot of freshman students reported feeling overwhelmed and anxious because they're negotiating complex academic environment, but also a social environment. They're not familiar with all these people, and now all these people from different backgrounds are here. It's often the first time they experience being on their own. So while it's exhilarating because it's a newfound autonomy, it's also very challenging having to navigate through that. And if you have disabilities, now you have additional challenges to address. And normally, for freshman students, able-bodied, they'll come in and you have the normal stress. You wonder, how would I get to my classroom from here to the library, to the canteen, to my dorm? But if you have disabilities, now you're thinking, oh, wow, to get to the library, it's very crowded. How can I keep my anxiety in control? So you have those additional stressors on top of the usual college stressors. For students with disabilities, whether you decide to reside at home in your home and then just travel to class or to campus, or whether you reside in campus, it doesn't matter. Either way, there is still a change in circumstance. And whenever you have a change in circumstance, that's always going to require adjustments. So stress and adjustments are real in college. Okay. Next slide, please. So expectations versus reality. You know, there is a study there by Plitz. He talked about there having a significant discrepancy between what a first-time, full-time freshman expectations are of what college is and what they think other people think of them and what it actually is in real life. Of course, it takes time, but it has a play in their confidence because they think, oh, college should be okay and I'll be okay and everybody will think I'm cool. Well, when you get there, it's a totally different crowd and a totally different culture. So this discrepancy in expectations versus reality, it actually becomes a key factor as a barrier to their completion goals. Now it's starting to play tricks in their heads. This is not what I thought it would be. Would I be okay? Well, if it's not okay, should I think about dropping out? So it's really important for institutions to understand what those student expectations are, because those student expectations, they're formed from their set of beliefs of what they think college would be like. And this is something I forgot to mention earlier. The studies that have been done on student retention in the earlier years, the perspective is that from the institution. Now, what can the institution do? How can we retain them? But now in the later years, there's actually a shift in perspective. We're now thinking from the student's perspective. So what are students thinking? So that's kind of like where this line aligns, is we need, for the institutions, we need to think about what the student is thinking and approach it from that way. And hence the relevance of this study really is because we're trying to look at the factors that would make students drop out from their perspective and what from their perspective thinks the institution needs to do to keep them in school. Okay, next slide, please. And then there's a theme of amount of transition preparedness. So for those who are successful in transitioning from high school to college, freshmen, it's usually attributed to a few things. Socioeconomic factors. They can afford tutors, or they can afford counselors to help the student plan for the future. And then there's supportive high school counselors and teachers, and usually they support those students who are academically more, I'd say they have achieved higher academic grades. And then they also have parental support and other related factors that's actually related to support, like friends, or as I mentioned, mentors, those who guide them. But what I want to stress is that this is not the norm. Those who are successful from high school to college, that's not the norm. It's good that they're able to do that, but that's the exception. The norm is a lot of freshman students, and especially SWDs, in the first few days, first few weeks, in fact, that first year, they will experience a lot of stress. There's a lot of stressors, they will experience a lot of anxiety, and that is the norm. In fact, Pleats, in his study, he talked about how there's, in the recent years, there's just numerous instances of the phenomenon of the entrance of underprepared SWDs into college. And this transition, preparedness, a lot of high schools are trying to come up with a transition plan for the students, but a lot of those plans are different from school to school, and also they're still in developmental phases. A lot of them are. A lot of those programs are based off transition focus, but conceptual or conceptual framework rather than practical framework. So there are some transition programs out there, but it's still, at this point, they're still lacking. Okay, next slide, please. Stigma. Stigma is that negative attitude that's given to a person because they relate that person to something not worthwhile, or we'll just say negative. And in college, most teachers do tend to have a generally positive perception. However, because of lack of awareness, some think that students with disabilities, they fake their disabilities, and that they're just masking their less academically proficient status. So it's, a lot of students tend to not disclose their disabilities to the Office of Student Disabilities in campus. A lot of them are because they're not aware, and they're not good advocates, and they don't realize that they need to advocate for their own disability, to ask for accommodations. But then some of them voluntarily do not disclose their disability because of the stigma. In fact, one of my participants in the study, he has vision problems, so he's one of those that come into school, come into class early enough so he can get the front seat. And if he doesn't make it early enough, he ends up in the back, and then he ends up with severe headaches at night, which may be debilitating enough that it affects his studies, because instead of the time studying, you're just trying to nurse your headache. And he does not want to disclose his disabilities, even though he also has anxiety problems. And when he was in high school, he was number 2 ranking academically in a class of about 300 total, in his campus. And he stressed himself so much to try to perform well that he ended up being hospitalized and taken out of high school. He did get his GED and actually graduated before his classmates, because he's just that gung-ho about academics. But he refuses to disclose the anxiety or the vision problems because of the stigma. And then there are classmates who question the fairness of the academic support and accommodation that the students with disability may get. There may be an instance, if you're both taking tests and the time is up, the able-bodied will turn in the paperwork and notice that the classmate is still writing and is possibly cheating, trying to complete the test past the time, not realizing that that person has accommodations of extended test times. So those perceptions play a role in the psyche of the students with disabilities. They start feeling like they're being treated as they're less smart and that they're lazy, indolent, or mentally incapable. And they're none of those. They actually have the capacity and they have the skills and they want to learn. It's just awareness of other people of their disability is not there. So instead, there is the stigma, there's the perception, and they don't want that. And when it becomes bad enough, they'll end up dropping out. I'd like to take this time to talk about another participant in my study. It was her second time being a freshman in college. She has severe anxiety. The first time she made it through 2 terms, and then the anxiety became so bad she dropped out of college and waited 7 years to build herself back up, her confidence, to enroll again. And she's experiencing the same anxiety, but she's hoping to last until completion, however long that may take. So the perceived special treatment of perceived perception of the other students that these SWDs are getting special treatment or that they're being high maintenance in the classrooms, that has a playing factor into the psychological part of the students with disability. Okay, next slide, please. As I said, it affects their self-esteem and their confidence. Eventually, that influences their decision to stay in the campus or to drop out. And it changes their ideas of their degree paths, their aspirations, their academic performance, and their motivation to ask for help, to ask for that accommodation. It affects their feelings of fitting in and that sense of belongingness. And that influences his or her willingness to participate or contribute in the classroom. Because most of the time, with that stigma, they think that this faculty, staff, and other students just think that they're coming up with excuses to not perform to the utmost, which for our students with disabilities is farthest from the truth. Next slide, please. So it's not just students that are having challenges. Institutions are also having challenges. So institutions, in order to retain this demographic, they have put in some measures to help these students with disabilities, but it's really not enough. And some of the issues that come up are faculty unpreparedness, the identification of disabled students at institutions and trying to figure out the types of disabilities, and then what are the faculty procedures for students with suspected disability. Next slide, please. So let's talk about faculty unpreparedness. So universities and colleges today are unprepared for the large enrollment of students with disabilities. Like I said, 20 million students coming in, but 20% of this are those with disabilities. So they should be prepared for both the able-bodied and the ones with disabilities when they come into the college campus. Sadly, most of them are not ready because 80% able-bodied, 20% disabilities. Well, majority of your interactions will be with able-bodied. So your preparation is dealt mostly for the majority, which is the able-bodied. And because that requires a lot of preparation by itself, they don't have enough time to think about the 20%, the ones with disabilities. So they lack the preparation to deal with these students with disabilities when they show up in the classroom. Many of them do not get the staff trainings because most of the time it's not offered in the institution. And then really how the faculty is, how open they are to the students, or how narrow-minded they are. It depends on the culture of inclusion in the institution. For some, it's open, and the more open the culture is, the more amenable they are to giving accommodations to the SWDs. What they really need, though, is focused professional development. Teach the staff and faculty, make them more aware about disabilities in the classroom. What type of students will you find there? What type of disabilities, and how can you give them accommodation? When you're aware, it improves the attitudes, the knowledge, and the skills of this faculty. Next slide, please. And this is important because faculty, more than the staff, is the first layer of interaction with the students. So you have the power as a faculty to become the greatest impact or be a barrier to that student with disability. And if you're going to be negative and dismissive of their challenges, it will end up in feelings of intimidation and rejection in that student with disability, which will then translate to negative relationships between student and faculty. The greater the awareness of the faculty, the higher the chances of that student remaining in campus and hopefully to the end of the program, completing it and graduating and become a contribution to society. This is such a significant improvement for an institution that Becker and Palladino in their 2016 study actually suggested removing not accommodating faculty and staff. Next slide, please. But then there are faculty who are empathetic and they may see that a student is struggling inside their classroom, academically, socially. However, this is also a challenge because, okay, in high school, it's mandated to locate their students with disabilities and actually support them and help them, IEPs. But in higher education, you're not required to identify students with disabilities. You would not know who's got the disability or not, especially if the disability is unseen. And you're not allowed to ask during admission process. It's really up to the student to self-identify and disclose. And they would do that only if they're aware of it and they can advocate for themselves and actually choose to disclose it. Next slide, please. So what types of disabilities should faculty look for in their classrooms? Disability in higher education is defined in very general terms according to ADAA and Section 504 of Rehab Act. This federal mandates define disability as any possible condition, very generalized, that significantly confines an individual's life activities. Next slide. So you could be looking at cognitive disabilities. You can't see it. You just have to observe it. You could see mild autism spectrum disorder, behavioral conditions, TBI. We have a lot of veterans now in classrooms. Speech and language disorders, ADD, PTSD. I was one of them. Structural and nervous system disorders, heart problems, hearing problems, visual problems, neurological disorder. And then there's others, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue syndrome. You may have Crohn's disease. All these things impact the student and it's impacting their academic performance, but the teacher doesn't know it. And if there's no disclosure, they still wouldn't know it. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, there's a lot of unseen disabilities out there. And if you're not aware, if you don't know what these are, you wouldn't know it. And if you have negative perceptions of disabilities to begin with, it won't get better until you get that awareness. So those who are not aware, they don't know how to provide accommodation. So this becomes a problem, a challenge. Next slide, please. But if you are that faculty that cares and you're empathetic enough and you suspect that student has a disability because of the academic and social dysfunctions, what do? So you can discuss that issue with the campus office of disability services because you cannot suggest, nor do you have a right to do so, talking to that student about a disability. You cannot pressure a student to disclose his or her disability. So the only thing you can do is go to the campus office of disability services. And unfortunately, some students during college don't even know that they have a disability until later on, because they may have mild tendencies for whatever disability, but It's not until they experience the stressors of college, the increased demands in academics and cognitive areas, that that disability now manifests itself later in their college years. So it becomes obvious later on, they didn't even know it. Next slide, please. So what support for SWDs do we have out there in institutions? We already talked about the physical accommodations, but there's also academic accommodations. There's autonomy, persistence, motivational elements, peer support system, and counseling services. So let's delve into each one of them. Let's go with academic accommodations. So academic accommodations, these are alternative methods. So a lot of people have a lot of students with disabilities. There's a high percentage of learning disabilities. So what these accommodations do, not just for learning disabilities and disability, is offer alternative methods to the students to remove that disability related barrier. What it does is it levels out the field with that able-bodied student next to you. It gives them a fair chance of making it. So it's not something that warrants a stigma. It's not something that's a special treatment. It's just giving them a fair chance. And that's really how we should look at it. It's not special treatment. It's not being high maintenance. And that accommodation has a basis on disability and individual needs. We can be looking at revamped school tasks like homeworks, papers, exams. If you're more audio rather than visual, you have visual problems, you can ask for an audio related assignment instead. Classroom seating, like I mentioned, that one participant I have that has visual problems. Use of assistive technology like speech-to-text devices or dictation apps. Peer tutoring programs, that's another thing. Next slide, please. And then we have the elements of autonomy, persistence, and motivational elements. Autonomy is a way in which the individual begins to decide to rely on their own self-determination. For our SWDs, that's what we want for them. We want them to have autonomy and learn independence so that outside of college, they will be able to have a successful life. College experience, this is the time for students to learn to resolve various issues. When you're on your own, because you're away from family and support, so it requires you to resolve that issue, which then develops your autonomy within your skill set. It's an important tool to last you a lifetime. And then when we talk about motivational elements, it differs from student to student. It may be support from your fellow classmates, peers. It may be joining a club. Whatever this motivates that student, it's important that they keep it because that's what helps them develop persistence. They insist on finishing class because you have this support, you enjoy doing this, you enjoy doing that. So all of this can be in or will be in the college campus. They'll just have to find it and then stick with it. Next slide, please. Peer support system. A lot of students ask for peer support system. In fact, in my study, majority of them ask for peer support because, as we talked about, despite their increasing numbers, many do not graduate because they have this feeling of isolation and exclusion. They have feelings of lack of support. They have feelings of being misunderstood or being unwelcome. And when staff and faculty do not know how to adequately deal with their needs, it doesn't help these feelings, these negative feelings. But if they can't get that support from staff or faculty, how about from peers? So when they're going through the same things that you are, it's easier to talk through things. Next slide, please. Counseling services. This is another thing that my participants also suggested. They want counseling services. A lot of them have anxiety issues, and it can be resolved just through counseling. About 4.3 million people are unable to graduate from their college degree programs due to early onset of a mental disorder. And this goes along with what I mentioned earlier. Some of them do not know that they have mental disorders until it became the academic load became too much that it finally triggered the mental disorder. And 30 to 45% of college learners self-disclosed a form of mental health disorder within their last year in school. Next slide, please. So those who did not seek out counseling service, they often procrastinated too long, to the point where it had reached a level that the campus cannot support anymore. So they end up dropping out. And then there's also not going for counseling despite knowing that you need to, because of the stigma, because of the fear of public knowledge and those negative perceptions, because they want privacy, and then some because of personal beliefs. And I believe, Dr. McKenzie, that we have a poll on this part, personal beliefs.
We do, and I'll share that. Let me stop this share, and then I will share again. For this poll, Dr. Kissling is asking you to either take your phone and hit the QR code here, or go to this website. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. You need this one. Go to this website and hit a hashtag 761642 to find this one. But if you'll go ahead and do that and just start answering the question, you can use one word, and you can also do multiple replies. We ask you to go ahead and do that now.
Embarrassment, stigma, embarrassing, fear. Keep going if you want to enter yours. I'll just keep talking so. And these are all true lack of knowledge of resources available, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
They're not aware of what help services are available, yes. Family, yes. Shame, yes. And let me tell you, one of my participants who has anxiety, he asked for peer support and also counseling services. And he actually made it a point to say anonymous counseling, online anonymous counseling, because of the fear, the embarrassment, the stigma. He did not want others to know. If it was a face-to-face counseling, he said he would not go. Shame. And I have another participant. He actually has a supportive family, but the family attaches stigma to mental disorders. It's a sign of weakness, no? So you don't want to bring that to the family. So that was a family belief. He doesn't necessarily share that because he's the one that needs the help. But family has a strong pull on you as well. Uncertainty, scared. Finances, that's absolutely true as well. I do believe the campus may be free, or perhaps some campuses, you may have to pay. Didn't know they could. Yes. And that all goes back to the awareness of what's out there and advocating for yourself. It's really important for students with disabilities to know, to have that support while they're still in high school, for that support to tell them, hey, when you go to college, you have to advocate for yourself. Go to Office of School Students with Disabilities and tell them that you have this. You may have to provide documentation, but that's part of the process. But you need that to get accommodations, because you want those accommodations, because you want to go into college at the same level as your able-bodied peers. When you don't have the accommodations, you're already behind. So it's not shameful to ask for those accommodations. You want the same fair chances. But as I said, it's important for the students to be aware of that. So it really has to begin before college. Not fitting in, not looking like others, overwhelmed, fatigue. Yes, fatigue is very real. I did hear of stories of students, especially if you have chronic fatigue, it takes them a while to travel from their dorm to classroom halls and then to the next class. By the time they get to the third class, they're out of steam. And then at the end of the day, you can't even do your homework. You can't study because you're just tired. So when we went online because of COVID, it was actually a blessing for them. Um, Dr. Mackenzie, I think we're good on this one. In
I was going
action
to
from
also
previous.
ask if anyone wants to put something in chat because they couldn't access this, they can actually put words in chat too. So we'll go ahead and stop this for now.
Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in that. And I agree with everything you guys said. And I'd like to think that we covered all of them. As I mentioned, this student, when a lot of students with disabilities, not all of them, because it really depends on disability, when we went to the online, it was a blessing for them because they're able to watch lectures where they can have closed captioning online, and they can replay the lectures if it's being recorded. So for these students, and they didn't have to travel from their dorm to the lecture halls, so there's less fatigue and there's less anxiety of group of crowded areas. When it was time to go back to in person, the anxieties came back and they're experiencing these challenges once again. So that was a recent articles or stories I've read. So there are those, and so those are the stories. And okay, so we're moving on. Personal beliefs. Okay, next slide, please. There's actually a lot of stories out there. We just can't give them all today. So let's move on to the framework about student retention. So when I did the study, there's got to be a framework for you to look at the material and then the findings. So Tinto is the father of student retention. He based his model from previous studies, but his is known as the D model, and that's what I used. But the main thing for his model is the academic and social integration. So whereas previous models before him put the onus of a student's success on the institution, saying, hey, the institution is responsible for the student's success. Here, Tinto is actually the first one to say, hey, the student actually also has some obligation to work with the institution so that they can be successful. So he's talking about the academic and social integration. Hey, student, how academically integrated are you with the school? How socially integrated are you in school? Because the more academically integrated you are, the more socially integrated you are, the better your chances are of completing. So when he talks about academic integration, this is easier than the two, than social, because academic, you put in the work, and then you ask for accommodations and you end up having good grades, so you're academically successful. You can see that you're academically integrated. But the social is harder to define. How well are you communicating with your faculty, with your staff, and then with your peers? Are you involving yourself in clubs, in activities within the campus? How much are you trying to assimilate yourself into what the campus has to offer you? The better your integration, the more likely you're going to say, oh, I like this campus, I like my program, I'm going to stay. So that influences your retention or departure decisions. And when he was doing his study, he didn't finalize it until 1993. In 1975, his model said that a student comes in with a set of beliefs, your family background, and then your academic achievements before coming in. Later on, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the earlier studies were just traditional students, 4-year straight from high school going into college. Later on, a lot of the researchers did explore the diverse subgroups in the colleges. And then one other thing I like about his later model is that he added the states of passage from Van Gennep's work into the framework, where it said, you have transitions from youth to adulthood, and you have rites of passage. Well, in a model, in a student retention model, you also have rites, or I should say passages or transitions. You have separation, transition, and incorporation. Okay, next slide, please. And I like this concept of separation, transition, and incorporation because I see this in real life also in work. So when that student comes in with his own family background, with his high school peers in his mind, the high school culture, and then his academic achievements in high school, then you go into college, you must switch your mentality and intentionally adopt the values of norms of the new community. Your new community is your college. It is time to shed those old ones and start thinking college. If you are stuck with your high school concepts, you're not allowing yourself to be assimilated or integrated into your new background. And then once you do that, you're transitioning in, you go through a final transition, which is your membership in the institution's social environment. So at this point, you're very well integrated. You are thinking, you're aligned with the institution and your academic background. So other modifications throughout the years that he did to his study, to his model, goal commitment, academic advising, social support, interactions, and cultural barriers. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of the data findings that I did? So I had 13 students, and this is very interesting because I was looking for access for freshman college students when the pandemic hit. So it took me about 6 months to actually have a university to do research on, because at that point, everybody was trying to figure out how do we transition from in-person to Zoom. And me, Dr. Kissling, just looking for access was low priorities. So it was quite interesting doing a dissertation during the pandemic. But when I finally did get my 13 participants, I had to open up my survey to other students in other universities through social media, through Facebook, WhatsApp, because my one college that I was going for, I didn't have enough students from there because of the pandemic in the summertime and just interesting times. But when I did get the results from the 13, they were consistent with Tinto's 1975 student integration model. I talked about social integration and academic integration, social factor and academic factor. So these freshman college students with disabilities were affected the academic factor and the social factor. Their number one stressor is performance pressure. More than half of them said that when they're in a classroom and they're being compared, their grades are being compared with others, that induces a lot of pressure on them. So, and they know that they have disabilities and that they're going to be behind. So just that by virtue alone, they're already at a disadvantage. So when there's a performance comparison, that is enough for them. When it becomes too much, they will drop out. They will drop out of college. And we're talking freshman students. And then the next one is stress and anxiety. So this is a social factor. So this affects social integration. So when they have a lot of anxiety, and I mentioned one of them did drop out, and actually I found out later on that a couple of my participants also dropped out because of stress and anxiety. This is enough for them to drop out. So these two together, academic and the social factor, as Tinto said, these two things, they start thinking about this, and this affects their decision to, should I stay or should I go? And also their degree path, their motivation. Then a few of them said that when their needs are not met, they will drop out of college. So what they wanted is for the institution to check on them regularly on their status, like a monitor thing. Hey, how are you? How are you coping with your academics? What's your load? Or how's your social participation? Are you having trouble with that because of accessibility, or what is it? Are you feeling included, or do you feel excluded because they have these events at the beach and you can't get there because you're on a wheelchair? Stuff like that. When they don't get considered their needs to get to that event place for participation, they feel excluded. So that doesn't help with the whole inclusion thing. They want more communication and facilitation from their teachers and their staff, but doing so, it must come with empathy too. They don't really want that faculty talking to them, knowing that this faculty does not believe in them. One of my participants, she said that it took her, she's had 3 meetings with the teacher about a presentation, and the teacher is still not understanding why she's wanting accommodation for her presentation. So she's not feeling very positive about her class, and she's not really feeling good about her program right now or at that time of the study. And then there's also the uncaring teachers. They get this feeling that because there's no empathy, that they're uncaring. So why bother coming to class? My teachers are not supporting me. They don't believe in me. Okay, next slide, please. About 3 of them, mostly veterans, are satisfied with the institution's programs. The GI Bill is paying, the government's paying for them. So no matter what, they gotta make it. I'm not even gonna bother with what's being offered. I just gotta make it. So that's the attitude they have. And most of the veterans, you will find that same attitude, and they do happen to be veterans. There is a need for anonymous counseling and therapy and peer support system. We talked about that. Those not seeking out is because of fear, negative perception, stigma. And the peer support system, the students ask for peer support, but mainly from senior students, because the senior students are close to the finish line. If they made it that far, what did they do? What did they take? What does it take to navigate to get that far? I want to know. So they want senior students telling them, especially if it's the same disability as what they have, how did you navigate? How did you make it? So that they can follow suit. And then administration, faculty, unfortunately, because they don't know how to deal with their needs, and which leads to cousins and others in 2015 arguing for the same thing, establishment of a peer support system. Next slide, please. So the recommendations for practice that I found is mainly to engage all levels of staff, especially professors, to increase staff awareness. And this aligns with what the participants said. They want professors to be trained. They want the professors to understand the challenges that they're going through, why they need accommodations, why they're asking for that. And then to communicate to them about performance and the social stressors. Show me that you care about me. And empathy instead of belief. Oh, you really do need this. And how are you? Because I know you got to be tired by now. Instead of, you're just faking it. You're just lazy. That's not what they want to hear. And then next slide, please. Campus Anonymous online counseling and therapy. They want privacy. They want peer support system, and then mentoring. Next slide. Students with disabilities who persist, they complete their studies, but at a longer time frame. And a lot of that is because they can only handle the minimum workload, because the rest of the time while people are studying, they're taking care of their own physical and mental well-being, which they need in order to function. As one student said, it's almost like I have to choose between passing my course or how did she say that? She said, like, dying, because that's eventually what her disability would, if it's bad enough, it'll get to that point. So that was kind of, that had an impact on me. When a student does take a longer time to graduate, when they double the time, there is a risk that we'll lose them from school, because the cost, you still, if it's anything like my college, I know most colleges are like this, Enrollment fees, tuition fees increase every year. A student who graduates sooner can earn sooner. Society can benefit from newly acquired knowledge and skills. Okay, next slide. This study is relevant because researchers have sought to determine how to improve academic performances and completion rates. Their numbers are increasing, but the completion rates lag behind. And hopefully we've mentioned the factors that they said would make them drop out and what they want to help keep them in class. Okay, I think I have one more slide. If they complete, that means completion rates for the institution and funding for the institution, good employment prospects, in autonomy, independence, less dependence on welfare and disability aid, and for the society, you have talent in the workforce. And this is actually the end. Next slide, please. I'll just say questions. But I do have one story to tell, and then we'll open it up to quick questions. There is a lawsuit that happened in Northeast Massachusetts against Draycote Public Schools. And the student has autism, and he graduated from high school. But when it came to college, he was not able to navigate. And the student sued the school district because they said, my son is not ready for college. None of the things he learned from college translated to him being able to survive in college. So you failed us. School said, no, he completed the required academic requirements. So we've done our part. We've done our obligations. It's good to go. Well, the family said, no, it's more than that. If he can't function outside of high school, you failed. And they actually won the case. So the impact of this case is very unique. What happened is now they have a transition process, which a lot of schools do, but now they are getting better in reassessing the student before they graduate as to how they would function outside and come up with a program that would help them past high school. So hopefully we'll see that in more and more public districts or schools, period. And that actually ends my presentation. We have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kissling. I'm going to put the survey in chat for everyone. Let me see. While we're taking questions, does anyone have any questions?
I do, but I always have questions. So a couple of things that you said when you said that I was asking questions. So first you talked about the numbers of students with disabilities who are enrolled in college. Do you have any numbers for students who have disabilities but do not report them?
I don't, but I mean, I have the material. I have to get it and actually extract it, but I can get you that.
Okay. And then I had another question. You mentioned that students who didn't have disabilities or recognized they had disabilities before they came to college end up their last year of college having a recognized disability. Do you know why it's the last year and why that number is so high?
I really believe that that's because by this point, like the first year is kind of easy. You tend to socialize more, but by the time and mostly like general topics, first year, second year, and then third year, you start getting heavier academic loads, academic courses. It becomes, like you may begin with your thesis at this point. So the load itself is becoming harder and heavier. So at this point, if you didn't have anxiety before, you probably have anxiety now. And if you had the tendency to have anxiety at this point, it's probably made it heavier. So this is where it gets manifested at this point. So okay. About the last year.
And you mentioned, I have questions, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
The pandemic. And I know you finished your dissertation during the pandemic, but do you know, have you done research since then on the impact of the pandemic on anxiety diagnosis on the stress, if it has increased it? I know you mentioned that for some people it decreased it, but do you know if there's research that talks about how students are doing now?
Um, I did read a few things on that, and what it showed, um, it's not really like studies, but more like articles. So I'll have to look into the scholastic journals. But the ones that I've read, like just the articles, it talked about students' anxieties actually going back up, uh, since now we're starting to go back into the in-person class. So they want to keep it to the online because they're able to catch up better. Like they can replay the lecture, they can read closed captioning. But at the same time, I say that, but I've also seen articles where students had a hard time with online format because they're not able to keep up with the technology or the attention. They're not good with technology just because of the nature of the disability, like autism. Um, so that did not go well for them. But I read more of the other side. So just, I think half, you know.
Thank you.
So I have a question. You had spoken about faculty's involvement in retention. Have you done any research on trainings and trainings that are effective, specific for faculty? Because, you know, when I think about, especially my experience as a TA, this has been several decades ago, way before technology, you know, that's something that's never spoken about, you know, in our, you know, we did have training in the Department of Modern Languages. We had trainings on how to teach certain topics, but the question or issue of how we might encounter someone with an accessibility issue, that's never really discussed. And I'm speaking specifically for my discipline. That's really not something that we talk about. I think maybe in education programs that might be talked about. It's specific to how you teach, let's say K through 12. But as far as higher education, that's really not something outside of, let's say, an education department that might be spoken about. Do you have any suggestions or how you could close that gap, I guess?
Yeah. While I was doing my research, I did come across a few studies. I'll have to go back into it, but there were a few that addressed that. It didn't really go into the details, but if I were to go back, and since I have an interest in that, I might even do that actually. I can get back with you on that one and find out what those suggestions are.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm curious. It's just something that I think faculty is an important part of this process of helping to retain all students. But I think in a lot of ways, and I'm not speaking for anyone specific, but we think that that's always staff's problem or staff's, you know what I mean? The student services issue, that's their thing to deal with. And then we're just kind of in the background. And, you know, my perspective is different because I've worked in student services. So, you know, I do have, you know, trainings and of course, Teresa as a resource. But a lot of faculty members, I think, might feel that that's their problem, not our problem. And I think that is important in many ways to thing to address. But thank you.
Absolutely. And that goes back to one of the things I have on my slide, because you're the first layer of interaction as a teacher, you have the power to be the greatest influence or the barrier. So.
Yes, right. Thank you.
There is a question in the chat.
Yes, so the question is, are the same requirements and expectations on SWD for universities the same for technical schools? Do technical schools have any data on SWD like colleges do?
You know, I'll be honest with you, when I was doing my research, I did not see very many material on technical schools. at all. So that's probably a gap in the literature, in the body of knowledge. And somebody needs to do a research. Somebody needs to do a dissertation on that one. So I'm so sorry I don't have an answer for you at this point. Might become my next dissertation though. Just thought.
Any other questions?
Sorry.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Kissling. It was a really very informative, and I really appreciate you doing this for us today. And Teresa, I'll turn it over to you, I guess.
Thank you, everyone. It is afternoon. We've been here for several hours, so I want to say thank you. Good afternoon. As we close this year's Envision Access Conference, I would like to thank you for attending. The last year and this year, we did them both virtual because of the pandemic. We're hoping to go back to a face-to-face format in the future, but we hope that when you attend it today, that you leave this conference with information that will help you, help your current students, your future students, will help you as you navigate workplace accommodations, will help you as you help others to navigate those same accommodations. We'd also like to thank Dr. Josephine Bennett and Dr. Rosa Kissling for presenting today. You both gave us so much information. I have wrote down a lot of questions on both, so I know I'm going to have more questions. We want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and inspiring all of us to be allies for students with disabilities and ourselves, and then others in the workplace. The conference survey was placed in the chat window. We ask that you take a few minutes to complete this. If you attended both sessions, you'll need to do the form twice because there's a checkbox for each one. So our conference next year will be in person Friday, March 3rd, 2023. We look forward to seeing you in person. We hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon and stay safe. Goodbye, everyone.